All right, buckle up, y'all, because we are on week 3 of BlockEats, our 8-week intuitive eating cycle. And I'm a little nervous about this week, to be honest, because we're talking about 2 different principles, and one of them I think is one of the hardest to wrap your brain around and to practice. But I'm ready. In fact, I already made this whole video once and scrapped it. I'm starting over. I'm a little nervous because at first it may sound like I'm trying to get you to do something unhealthy. But remember, intuitive eating is about mental well-being and physical well-being. And it's about trying to get to a place where we can make good decisions about food from a neutral space. And I want to remind you that we are going to talk about nutrition and how nutrition fits into intuitive eating. We've got to do some other things first so that we're not making nutritional choices in like a obsessive, stressed out, diet culture-y way. Nutrition is usually the last principle of intuitive eating that you learn about, and it's for a good reason. So the ability to stop eating when you're full and you've had biologically enough hinges on your ability to give yourself permission to eat. So the principles we're talking about this week are feeling your fullness and making peace with food. So last week we talked about hunger, so it makes sense that this week we talk about fullness. You remember that hunger scale from last week. We want to stay mostly in the neutral to pleasant level of fullness. We don't want to get to that overly full level. If you had trouble feeling your hunger, you might also have some trouble feeling your fullness. Fullness is going to feel a little different for everybody, so just start paying attention to when you're starting to feel full and satiated. So this sounds easy peasy, right? Eat when you're hungry, stop eating when you're full. Okay, see you next week. No, just kidding. One of the things that gets in the way of us doing this is if we've been restricting a kind of food or an amount of food. Our beliefs, thoughts, and experiences with food affect our biology. Huberman talked about this on a podcast he put out recently where they gave diabetics a shake that they told was a high sugar shake, but actually wasn't, and it still affected their blood sugar. So our thinking about food not only directly affects our mental health, it actually affects our physiology. So making peace with food means we take away the moral judgment around food and we allow all food. So food isn't good or bad, and we are not good or bad for eating certain foods. And we allow all foods in our diet. I know, this is where you freak out and you go, but what about my health? But remember, stressful thinking around food affects your physiology. So we want to get to a place where we can be neutral with food. When we have restrictions around food, even if it's just mental restrictions, then often when we do eat that food, we tend to go overboard and overeat. And this is where we might have that out of control feeling about food. So this week, to practice feeling your fullness, see what fullness feels like to you. Do a check-in in the middle of your meal and see if you're still enjoying it and if you're still hungry. A lot of times food actually starts tasting not as good when we start getting to that fullness level. So play with that and see what that's like. You can also try eating without distraction. So without the big screens, without the little screens, not driving, just sit and eat. I know this is hard these days and we can't do it all the time, but maybe give it a shot and see if it helps you tune in to the cues from your body about when you are starting to feel full. Reinforce your conscious decision to stop eating. So once you feel like you've gotten to that good level of fullness, give yourself some sort of visual cue that you are done. So push the plate away, put your napkin on your plate, go pack up the rest of your food, something like that. Last week in the Cup of Joe with Joe talked about how it can be a little uncomfortable to be eating when nobody else is eating or not eating when everybody else is. Wait, is that the same thing? Anyway, so this week, one of the ways you can feel your fullness is to say no to obligatory eating. So I know that can be hard sometimes in social situations, but you're the boss of you. Put up some boundaries, practice saying no. Don't eat if you're not hungry. If you notice that you're eating past fullness or you're still eating when you're not hungry, remember that there might be emotional reasons why, and we're going to talk more about that another week. That's coming, but still just continue to pay attention to that. So your other piece of homework this week is to try to get a little more neutral around your thinking around food and try to allow all food. I know this is scary, but again, once you allow all food and take away that mental restriction, it tends to help us with not overeating or binging. It also takes away a lot of the mental load around food and a lot of the guilt or shame around food if we do end up overeating those foods. Habituation can help with this. Habituation explains how when we have a repeated experience over and over, it doesn't have the same effect on us. Habituation happens in all areas of our life. It's like when the first time your loved one says, I love you, and you're like, oh, and then a year later you're saying, I love you at the end of every call. We can use habituation to our benefit with food. So if we have a restricted food, we can use a habituation practice. You're gonna make a list of foods that you really enjoy, but that you tend to restrict. Then you can pick one food on that list to allow. When you take away the restriction around food, the food loses its power over you and you gain freedom. I know it can feel a little counterintuitive at first, and it can be scary to allow foods that you've restricted for a long time, but it works. And again, this is where people go, Kelly, what about my health? Remember, these are stepping stones to get us to a place where we can make informed decisions without all the emotional baggage. When we stop the restricting, we tend to not overeat as much. We tend to not binge. We tend to not have the guilt and shame around food. It puts us in a better space in our mental health, and it allows us to make better choices around nutrition. But we've got to do that foundation work first. Okay, story time. So I had a student in my class, she was graduating, and on the last day of school, her family brought in 2 giant boxes of those super fancy donuts from that new donut shop in Redlands. And we were gonna celebrate the end of the year. We were gonna cut the donuts in half. Everybody was gonna have half a donut. Wild, cool flavors. And of course, I wanted to celebrate with my class. So I had to make a decision. Am I going to have a half a donut with my students, knowing that I really like donuts? And if I have a half a donut, I'm probably gonna want more than a half a donut. I wanna eat all the donuts. Or am I going to have the half a donut and just know that that feeling's coming? Maybe it's that little dose of dopamine that it gives me, or that perfect combination of fat and sugar, and I'm gonna have to ride out that little bit of a craving that I expect will come. Or do I wanna just avoid it altogether so I don't have to deal with that feeling? Or do I just wanna go ham and eat all the donuts? So again, our experience with food, our expectations with food, and knowing how foods are gonna make us feel help us make choices. I hadn't eaten a lot of breakfast. I typically don't eat a lot in the morning. And so I knew that maybe half a donut I would still feel okay, but if I ate more than that, I would probably not feel great. So I was able to make a choice, okay, which path do I wanna go down today? I ate a half a donut. Yes, I wanted to go back and eat the whole box because they were delicious. So I wrote out that little tiny craving, knowing that my body is actually gonna feel better if I don't eat all the donuts in the box, even though they looked amazing. But because donuts aren't really like a restricted food anymore, and I'm not gonna feel any guilt around eating the half a donut, I'm not gonna go overboard, it's kind of not that big of a deal anymore. So that's an example of how habituation and not restricting food can actually help you make a balanced choice. One thing that helps me is kind of carrying the story all the way through to the end. If I do this, then how am I going to feel? Because you have experience with these foods. You have experience with emotional responses to foods. You have experiences with how your body feels when you eat certain foods. And so all that experience will help you make a good choice. And if you're not restricting, you're gonna tend to not overeat or binge on that food. Like I said, I think making peace with food can be one of the hardest principles to really practice. So remember to be patient with yourself. Start with your thinking. It takes a little bit of practice to change our thinking and to set new practices in our life. But just know that you can have freedom from food. You can get over the obsession, the overthinking, the worrying, the guilt, the shame. And all of these things can help you make better decisions for your health in the long run, from a better place of mental health to support your physical health. So thank you so much. I really appreciate all the good questions and all the feedback I've gotten in the gym. Have a great week, and I'll see you at the gym.